Say that again, slower this time. The sentence didn't just land. It sliced through the low hum of conversation like a thin blade, precise and deliberate, drawing a few scattered chuckles from men who measured worth in net value and tone in dominance. The restaurant sat 40 floors above Manhattan, wrapped in glass and gold, where the skyline stretched like a promise only a few could afford to keep, where a single dinner could cost more than a month's rent in Brooklyn, and tonight, at the center of it all, a deal worth $800 million hovered in the air like something fragile, something waiting to break. Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping once against the rim of his crystal glass, a habit of control, of timing, of knowing exactly when to speak and when to let silence do the work for him, his tailored navy suit sharp enough to reflect the soft amber lights above, his expression calm but edged with something colder, something that had built empires and ended careers without ever raising its voice. Across the table, Naomi Carter stood with a tray balanced in one hand, posture straight, movements quiet, the kind of quiet that came not from weakness but from years of being overlooked, her uniform pressed, her hair pulled back neatly, her presence designed to blend into the background of wealth and conversation. Yet there was something about her stillness that didn't quite fit, something that didn't bend as easily as the room expected it to. Go ahead, Ethan added, tilting his head slightly, a faint smile playing at the corner of his lips. We want to understand you. Laughter followed, softer this time, more contained, the kind that hid behind expensive watches and polite manners, but it was there, unmistakable, hanging in the air between the clink of silverware and the distant echo of jazz drifting from the main floor below. Naomi didn't move right away. Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the tray, not enough for anyone to notice unless they were looking for it, not enough to break the illusion of calm she had mastered over years of double shifts and quiet endurance, but enough to register, enough to mark the moment. Around them, the table was filled with investors, advisors, men and women who spoke in percentages and projections, who nodded at numbers and dismissed anything that didn't sound like power. And yet none of them noticed the subtle shift in the air, the way something invisible had just tilted. Because this wasn't just a dinner. It wasn't just a negotiation. It was a test, though no one at the table realized who was actually being tested. Naomi stepped forward, just enough for the light to catch her face, just enough for her presence to become undeniable, and for the briefest second her eyes moved, not toward Ethan, not toward the laughter, but toward the stack of documents resting near his hand, the contract, the real reason everyone was there, her gaze sharp, calculating, gone as quickly as it appeared. Then she spoke, her voice steady, her accent still there, still real, still unpolished in the way they had already decided it was, and yet there was something else beneath it now, something quieter, something waiting. And somewhere between the skyline outside and the silence that followed, the balance of the room began to shift, just slightly, just enough that the man who thought he controlled everything had already made a mistake he didn't yet understand. No one at the table realized how quiet it had become until the absence of laughter started to feel louder than the laughter itself, like a room holding its breath without knowing why. And Ethan noticed it too, not with discomfort but with curiosity, the kind that came from a man used to controlling outcomes, not reacting to them, his fingers pausing mid-tap against the glass as his eyes settled back on Naomi, studying her now, not as background noise but as something slightly out of place, something that did not behave the way it was supposed to. Well, he said, voice smooth, measured, we are waiting. The words were light, almost playful, but there was an edge beneath them, a test wrapped in politeness, and a few people around the table shifted in their seats, unsure whether to laugh again or stay silent, unsure where the moment was going. Naomi placed the tray down gently on the edge of the table, the soft sound of glass meeting wood cutting through the tension like a quiet signal, her movements precise, unhurried, as if time had slowed just for her. And when she spoke again, it was not louder, not sharper but clearer, each word landing exactly where it needed to. Her accent still present, still hers, but no longer something to be reduced, no longer something small. Of course, she said, meeting Ethan's gaze for the first time, not challenging, not submissive, simply steady, and that steadiness did something unexpected. It disrupted the rhythm of the room, the invisible hierarchy everyone had been following without question. A man to Ethan's left cleared his throat, glancing briefly at the contract, then back at Naomi, as if trying to place her, trying to understand why the air felt different now, why the balance had shifted in a way he could not quite explain. Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table, posture relaxed but attentive, The posture of someone who sensed a shift and wanted to see where it led, because real power was not just about control, it was about recognizing when something unusual entered the room. "Then go ahead," he said again, softer this time, almost inviting but still testing. Naomi nodded once, a small motion, almost imperceptible, and for a moment, her eyes flickered back to the documents, the fine print, the clauses that most people skimmed but she had already read in passing, already processed in silence, her mind moving faster than anyone assumed it could, because assumptions were the easiest thing to make in a room like this, and the most dangerous thing to rely on. She reached for the edge of the contract, not touching it fully, just enough to indicate it, just enough to draw attention without asking for permission, and that alone caused a subtle ripple across the table, a shift in posture, a tightening of focus, because now she was no longer just speaking, she was stepping into the conversation itself. "Before I repeat anything," she said calmly, "you might want to take another look at Section 4, subsection B." The words landed differently this time, not because of volume but because of precision, because of confidence that did not ask for approval, and for the first time that night, the room did not laugh, it listened, and Ethan's expression changed, just slightly, just enough to reveal something rare, not doubt, not yet, but interest sharpened into attention, the kind that came right before a man realized he might not be the only one in control. For a moment no one moved, not because they did not understand what Naomi had said, but because they were trying to understand how she had said it. How a waitress who had just been reduced to a punchline was now pointing to a specific clause in a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars as if she had written it herself. And the silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, filled with recalculations happening in real time behind composed faces and expensive expressions. Ethan's eyes dropped to the document, not quickly, not reactively, but with intention, as if he were choosing to engage rather than being forced to. His fingers sliding the contract slightly closer, the paper whispering against the polished wood table, and for the first time that evening, he was not performing, he was reading. Around him others leaned in, subtle at first, then more openly, drawn by something they could not ignore anymore, because confidence, real confidence, did not announce itself, it redirected attention. And Naomi had just done exactly that. Section 4, subsection B, Ethan repeated quietly, almost to himself, scanning the lines, his brow tightening just enough to suggest concentration, not confusion, because men like him did not show confusion easily, but the shift was there, undeniable. Naomi did not speak again immediately, she did not rush to explain or justify, she simply stood there, composed, giving the moment space to unfold, because she understood something most people in that room did not, that timing was not just about speaking, it was about knowing when silence carried more weight than words. A woman across the table adjusted her glasses, leaning forward, her eyes moving quickly across the same section, and then it happened, a small pause, a fraction of a second where her expression changed, not dramatically, not enough to draw attention on its own, but enough to confirm that something was off, something had been missed. "Wait," she said softly, almost involuntarily, and that single word shifted the entire atmosphere, turning curiosity into focus, turning attention into urgency. Ethan looked up, not at Naomi, but at the others now, measuring their reactions, reading the room the way he always did, except this time, the room was not following him, it was following her. Naomi's voice came again, calm, precise, unshaken. "The liability clause does not transfer the way it is being presented," she said, her tone even, not confrontational, not defensive, simply factual, and then, without hesitation, she continued, her words flowing with a clarity that carried no trace of hesitation, no trace of the doubt they had projected onto her just minutes before, explaining the discrepancy in a way that did not just point out the error but revealed its implications, the kind of implications that could shift numbers, alter outcomes, and quietly dismantle assumptions. And then she did something that no one expected, not because it was dramatic, but because it was effortless. She transitioned seamlessly into Mandarin, addressing the international investors at the far end of the table with the same precision, the same control, her tone adapting, her cadence shifting, her accent no longer a point of mockery but a bridge, a tool, a demonstration of something far deeper than anyone had considered. The reaction was immediate, not loud, not chaotic, but visible, eyes widening, heads turning. A few quiet exchanges in return, confirmations passing between people who suddenly realized they had been underestimating the wrong person. Ethan did not interrupt her this time, he did not smile, he did not lean back. He listened fully now, his posture forward, his attention locked, because the room had changed, the balance had shifted, and somewhere between the laughter that started the night and the silence that now filled it, control had moved, not taken, not forced but revealed, and the mistake he had made was no longer hidden. It was unfolding in front of everyone. The last word in Mandarin settled into the room like a final piece clicking into place, and for a second no one spoke, not because they did not understand, but because they understood too well, and understanding had a way of silencing even the most confident voices when it arrived at the wrong time. The investors at the far end exchanged brief looks, subtle nods passing between them, the kind that carried weight without needing explanation, and one of them leaned forward, fingers resting lightly on the table as he responded in the same language, his tone measured, respectful, no longer directed at Ethan but at Naomi, and that shift, small as it seemed, was the kind that redefined rooms. Naomi listened, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, and when she replied, it was with the same clarity, the same precision, her words not rushed, not defensive but certain, each sentence reinforcing what she had already revealed, each phrase tightening the focus around the flaw in the agreement, and as she spoke, the contract in Ethan's hands began to feel heavier, not physically but in implication. Ethan's jaw set slightly, not in frustration but in concentration, his mind moving quickly now, recalculating, replaying the earlier conversation, the assumptions, the overlooked details, and for the first time that evening, he was not ahead of the moment, he was catching up to it. Is that accurate? One of the senior partners asked, directing the question not to Naomi, but to Ethan, and that alone marked a shift that could not be undone, because authority, once questioned in public, never returned in the same form. Ethan did not answer immediately, his eyes scanning the clause again, slower this time, more carefully, and the silence that followed was no longer controlled, it was earned, filled with the quiet recognition that something had been missed, something significant, something costly. Naomi stepped back slightly, not retreating, not withdrawing, but allowing space for the realization to settle, because she was not there to argue, she was there to reveal, and once something was revealed, it did not need to be defended. A faint sound of glass being set down echoed from somewhere along the table, a small, almost accidental noise that felt louder than it should have, because the room itself had changed, the energy no longer centered around performance but around truth. One of the investors closed his folder halfway, glancing at Naomi again, this time with a different kind of attention, not casual, not dismissive but deliberate, as if reassessing everything he thought he understood about the dynamics of the evening. Ethan finally exhaled, a controlled breath, his fingers flattening the edge of the document as he looked up, not at the group, not at the contract, but at Naomi, really looking this time, not at her uniform, not at her role, but at her presence, her composure, the quiet confidence that had not wavered once, and something in his expression shifted, not fully, not openly, but enough to signal recognition. "Continue," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of the earlier edge, no longer testing but acknowledging, and it was a single word, but it carried a weight that had not been there before, because this time, he was not asking her to repeat herself, he was asking her to lead. Naomi did not move right away after he said it, not because she hesitated, but because she understood the weight of that single word, because continue was not just permission, it was a transfer, subtle but undeniable, the kind that did not need to be announced to be real, and for a brief moment the entire table waited, not for Ethan, not for the contract, but for her. She stepped closer, just within reach of the document now, her fingers resting lightly on the edge as she turned one page with care, not rushing, not performing, simply guiding the attention where it needed to go, and as she spoke again, her voice carried the same calm precision, but now it held something more, not confidence earned in the moment, but confidence that had been there long before anyone in that room noticed it. "If you follow the language here," she said, her tone even, "the liability does not shift to the distributor under international enforcement standards, it stays with the originator," and she paused just enough for the words to land, just enough for the implication to settle into the space between them, because numbers did not scare people like Ethan but risk did, and this was risk, quiet, hidden, and until now, completely overlooked. A man to the right leaned forward, scanning the same lines, his lips pressing together as he read, his expression tightening not in confusion, but in recognition, the kind that came when something obvious suddenly became visible, and around the table, others followed, flipping pages, tracing clauses, the soft rustle of paper replacing the earlier laughter, a different kind of sound, one that signaled attention, not amusement. Naomi continued, not faster, not louder but deeper, connecting the clause to its consequence, outlining how the current structure would expose the company to a level of liability that could quietly erode the entire deal. Not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily over time, the kind of risk that did not make headlines but destroyed balance sheets. And as she explained it, there was no need for emphasis, no need for persuasion, because clarity, when delivered with precision, did not require decoration. Ethan listened without interruption, his gaze fixed on the document, his mind moving through the implications, recalculating projections, revising assumptions, and for the first time that night, he was not the one shaping the narrative, he was inside it, adjusting to it, and that shift, once it happened, could not be reversed. One of the investors closed his pen slowly, placing it beside his notebook, a small gesture but deliberate, as if marking the end of one understanding and the beginning of another. And then he looked at Naomi, not with curiosity now, but with respect, the kind that did not need to be spoken to be felt. "How did you catch that?" he asked, his voice quieter, more measured, and the question hung in the air, not as a challenge, but as an acknowledgement that something exceptional had just happened. Naomi did not smile, she did not shift her posture, she simply answered, "I read it." And in that simple response there was no attempt to impress, no effort to justify, just truth, clean and unembellished, and somehow that made it even more powerful, because in a room built on complexity, the simplest answer carried the greatest weight. Ethan finally looked up from the contract again, his eyes meeting hers, and this time, there was no trace of amusement, no trace of dismissal, only recognition, clear and undeniable, as the realization settled fully into place that the voice he had mocked minutes ago had just protected him from a mistake that would have cost far more than money. The question lingered in the air longer than expected, not because it was difficult, but because it shifted something deeper than the contract ever could, and Naomi felt it, not as pressure, not as attention, but as a quiet turning point, the kind that separates what people assume from what they are forced to see. She did not elaborate, did not expand on her answer, because she knew something the room was only beginning to understand, that explanation was not always power, sometimes restraint was, and by saying less, she allowed the weight of what she had already done to speak louder than anything she could add. Around the table the energy continued to evolve, no longer sharp or tense but focused, deliberate, the kind of focus that followed clarity, and one by one the investors adjusted their posture, leaning in, reviewing the document with a new level of scrutiny, no longer trusting the initial presentation, no longer assuming the structure was sound because doubt once introduced did not leave quietly. Ethan closed the contract slowly, not as a sign of dismissal but as a pause, a recalibration, his fingers resting on the cover as he exhaled, measured, controlled, but no longer untouched, and when he looked up again, his gaze did not carry the same certainty it had at the beginning of the night, it carried something else, something closer to awareness. "We will need to revisit this," he said, directing the statement to the table, but the meaning behind it reached further, because it acknowledged not just the flaw, but the shift that had exposed it. A few heads nodded, quietly, agreement forming not through discussion, but through recognition, the kind that did not require debate, and somewhere in that moment, the deal itself moved from momentum to caution, from confidence to reconsideration. Naomi stepped back slightly, her role returning to its surface appearance, the tray once again in her hand, her posture unchanged, as if nothing significant had happened, as if she had simply done her job, and yet the room no longer saw her that way, could not see her that way, because once perception changed it did not revert, it expanded. One of the investors spoke again, this time directly to her, his tone respectful, measured. "Where did you learn to read contracts like that?" And the question carried no trace of condescension, only genuine curiosity, the kind that followed discovery. Naomi met his gaze briefly, her expression calm, and answered with the same simplicity as before, "I pay attention." And again the room absorbed the response, not as deflection but as truth, because what she had demonstrated was not luck, not coincidence, it was awareness, disciplined, practiced, and quietly powerful. Ethan watched her closely now, not trying to assert control, not trying to recover the earlier dynamic, but observing, recalibrating, understanding that something fundamental had shifted, not just in the deal, but in the way he had misjudged the person standing in front of him. The skyline outside remained unchanged, the city lights steady, indifferent to what had just occurred 40 floors above, but inside the room, the atmosphere had transformed completely, and the man who had once measured intelligence by how it sounded was now confronted with a reality he could not ignore. That value did not announce itself the way he expected, and sometimes, the quietest voice in the room was the one that changed everything. The room did not return to what it was before, not after clarity had been introduced, not after assumptions had been exposed, because something subtle but irreversible had taken place, the kind of shift that did not make noise but changed everything that followed. Conversations resumed, but they were different now, quieter, more deliberate, each word measured against a new awareness that had not existed an hour ago, and the deal that once felt inevitable now moved carefully, cautiously, as if every line carried weight that could no longer be ignored. Ethan leaned back in his chair again, but the posture no longer carried the same ease, the same effortless dominance. It carried thought, recalculation, the quiet acknowledgement that control was not something you claimed once, it was something you maintained, and tonight, for a brief but defining moment, it had slipped. His eyes followed Naomi as she moved away from the table, returning to her role with the same composed efficiency, refilling glasses, adjusting settings, her presence once again blending into the rhythm of service, and yet nothing about her felt invisible anymore, not to him, not to anyone who had been paying attention. A man near the center of the table spoke softly to his colleague, their voices low but focused, discussing the implications of the clause, the adjustments that would now be required, the timeline that would inevitably shift, and beneath their conversation was something unspoken, a recognition that the most valuable insight of the night had not come from the executives, but from someone they had almost dismissed entirely. Ethan's fingers tapped lightly against the table again, but this time the rhythm was different, less certain, more reflective, and after a moment, he stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with intention, his chair sliding back with a soft sound that drew the attention of those closest to him. "Give us a moment," he said to the group, his tone calm, controlled, but no longer performative, and without waiting for a response, he stepped away from the table, his gaze already set on Naomi. She noticed him before he reached her, not by looking, but by sensing the shift in movement around her, the subtle pause in nearby conversations, and when she turned, her expression remained steady, unchanged, as if she had expected this, not hoped for it, not feared it, simply understood it as the natural next step. Ethan stopped. A few feet away, close enough to speak without raising his voice, far enough to maintain the distance that defined the world they were both standing in, and for a brief second, neither of them spoke, not out of uncertainty, but out of awareness, because this moment, unlike the one before, did not belong to performance, it belonged to truth. "You should not be working this floor," he said finally, his voice lower than before, stripped of the earlier edge, and there was no insult in it now, no assumption, just observation and perhaps something else, something closer to respect. Naomi held his gaze, calm, composed, and answered without hesitation, "I am exactly where I choose to be." And the simplicity of her response carried more weight than anything else she could have said, because it removed every assumption he had built, every narrative he had placed on her, and replaced it with something he could not control, her own decision. Ethan nodded once, slowly, absorbing the answer, and in that small motion was an acknowledgement he would not have made at the start of the night, that he had been wrong, not just about the contract, but about her, about what he thought he could measure, about what he thought he understood. And as the city lights continued to glow beyond the glass, steady and indifferent, the lesson settled quietly into the space between them, not spoken, not announced, but undeniable. For a moment the distance between them held not as a barrier, but as a boundary clearly defined, quietly respected, and in that space, something unfamiliar settled into Ethan's expression, not hesitation, not uncertainty but consideration, the kind that did not come easily to someone who had spent years moving faster than everyone else in the room. He glanced briefly back toward the table, where conversations had resumed in hushed tones, contracts being reviewed again with a level of care that had not existed earlier, and then his attention returned to Naomi, sharper now, more intentional, as if he were recalibrating not just the deal, but his entire understanding of the night. "You caught something my entire legal team missed," he said, his voice steady, no trace of the earlier mockery, and while the statement was simple, it carried weight, acknowledgement layered beneath it, because in a world built on hierarchy, recognition did not come easily, and when it mattered. Naomi adjusted the edge of her sleeve slightly, a small, almost habitual movement, her composure unchanged, her presence grounded in something that did not depend on the room's approval, and when she answered, it was with the same clarity that had shifted the entire evening. "They did not miss it," she said calmly. "They just did not look at it the way I did." And the distinction, subtle but precise, reframed everything, because it was not about intelligence, it was about perspective, about Attention, about the willingness to see what others overlooked. Ethan let the words settle, his gaze steady on her, and for a second there was no response, just the quiet acknowledgement that she was right, that the flaw had been there all along, visible to anyone willing to notice it, and that realization carried more weight than any mistake ever could. Around them the rhythm of the restaurant continued, servers moving between tables, glasses refilled, conversations flowing, the outside world unchanged, but inside that small pocket of space, the narrative had shifted completely, no longer defined by status but by substance. "What is your background?" Ethan asked after a moment, not as an interrogation, not as a challenge, but as a genuine question, the kind that came when assumptions had been stripped away and replaced with curiosity. Naomi met his gaze again, steady, unguarded, and answered without hesitation. "I studied international business and contract law." And there was no embellishment, no attempt to impress, just truth delivered plainly, and that simplicity made it impossible to ignore. Ethan's expression shifted again, this time more visibly, not shock, not disbelief, but realization layered with something deeper, something closer to respect, because the gap between what he had assumed and what stood in front of him was no longer abstract, it was undeniable. "Then why are you here?" he asked, the question quiet, almost careful, as if he understood now that the answer would not be simple. Naomi's eyes softened slightly, not in weakness but in reflection, and for the first time that evening, there was a hint of something personal beneath her composure, something that did not need to be explained in detail to be understood. "Because not every opportunity looks like an office," she said, her voice even, her words measured. "And not every lesson comes from a place people respect." And in that moment the answer extended beyond her, beyond the restaurant, beyond the night itself, speaking to something larger, something that did not fit neatly into titles or expectations. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing the response, and as he did, the final pieces of the night fell into place, not loudly, not dramatically, but with quiet certainty, because the mistake he had made was no longer just about a comment or a contract, it was about perspective, about the limits of what he thought he could measure, and as Naomi turned slightly, preparing to return to her work, the power in the room did not follow the title it had started with, it followed her. Unseen but undeniable. Naomi did not rush back into motion, not because she needed time, but because she understood something most people in that room were only beginning to grasp, that moments like this did not end with noise, they ended with quiet shifts that changed everything that followed. And as she lifted the tray again, her movements were the same as before, precise, composed, unremarkable to anyone who had not been paying attention, but to those who had, nothing about her was invisible anymore. Ethan remained where he was for a second longer, watching her step back into the rhythm of the restaurant, watching how easily she returned to a role the room could no longer reduce her to, and in that stillness something settled into him, not regret, not in the dramatic sense but recognition, the kind that rewrites how a man sees the world, not all at once but permanently. He turned back toward the table slowly, his posture straight, his expression controlled but no longer untouched, and as he took his seat, the conversation paused just long enough to acknowledge his return, not out of deference but out of expectation, because now the direction of the evening no longer belonged entirely to him. "We restructure," he said, his voice calm, deliberate, and this time there was no performance behind it, no attempt to dominate the room, just clarity, the kind that comes after being corrected, after being forced to see what was always there. And one by one the others nodded, not because he led them there, but because the truth had already done that work. The contract was reopened, pages turning again, but differently now, slower, more careful, every clause examined with the understanding that something important had already been missed once, and would not be missed again. Across the room Naomi moved between tables, her presence steady, her focus unchanged, and yet every so often, a glance followed her, not out of curiosity, but out of respect, quiet, unspoken but real, the kind that does not fade once it is earned. Ethan's eyes found her again, just briefly, not lingering, not calling attention but acknowledging, and then he looked back down at the document, the numbers, the structure, the deal that would now move forward differently because of her, because of a voice he had tried to diminish, because of a perspective he had almost ignored. Time passed, not quickly, not slowly, but with purpose, the meeting reshaping itself around a new understanding, and when the final notes were made, when the adjustments were agreed upon, the atmosphere no longer carried the same tension it had at the beginning of the night. It carried something steadier, something grounded in clarity rather than assumption. As the group began to rise, chairs sliding back, conversations shifting toward closure, Ethan stood once more, his gaze moving across the room until it found Naomi again, and this time there was no hesitation, no distance left unacknowledged. He gave a small nod, nothing grand, nothing performative, just a gesture, simple and deliberate, and she returned it with the same quiet composure, no smile, no need for one, because the moment did not require validation, it had already proven itself. She turned back to her work just as she had before, and the room continued just as it always did, but the difference was no longer in what people saw, it was in what they understood, because that night was never about a contract or a deal or even a mistake. It was about the limits of perception, and how easily power confuses itself with certainty. He had the room at the start. She never needed it. She only needed the truth.